I'm kind of a bibliophile. I like your background there.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm in graduate school and I'm going for library science degree. So I thought that would be the perfect background because I do quite a bit of Zoom.
Yeah. Wonderful. I shouldn't use the word too many, but I have a lot of books. I don't want to, I never like getting rid of them, so.
And I work at the public library and I'm part of the Friends of the Library. So we have to, I deal with books all the time.
Wow.
Wonderful.
So I will meet you if you're there. I'm only in Carlsbad on Sunday in person, the second Sunday, so I'll be there this coming Sunday.
Oh, okay. That's awesome.
But if you were at church last Sunday, you saw me. I didn't see you.
Yes, I saw you on video.
Well, Laura, you and I have something in common. My daughter-in-law used to work for the Roswell Public Library and retired from there about 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Her name is Bianca Cheney. I don't know if you ever met her.
No, because I've only been at the Carlsbad Public Library mostly since 2008.
Okay. You probably would have met her, but yeah, she worked there for the city of Roswell for 25 years, and now she's working with her husband.
Oh,
But she's
wow.
still a member of Friends of the Library.
Okay, so
Okay.
last week I think one of the more interesting and violent times in the whole Bible. Jael killed the general Sisera by driving a tent stake into his head, and we are in. So the time of the judges, if you think about, it sort of predates the kings. So before this, they didn't really have, and if you think about the chosen people, how they sort of organize themselves in terms of sort of politically, when they're traveling through the desert and when they're settling, it pretty much falls on Moses and then Aaron to do decisions for the whole of the people. But then after this point, you have, we think, a few hundred years of judges who, they are judges in the sense that we think of today, like they did help settle disputes and stuff like that, but they were really the leaders of the people. And you have, in this case, you have Deborah, who is a judge. So it's interesting when we put it was a patriarchal society still, even then it was, but there's lots of examples biblically of female leaders, you know, and this is just one of them. Deborah is if there's a dispute between the people, or if there's a decision that needs to be made for the benefit of all the people, they come to Deborah. So this chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, which has to do with her decisions to both in battle in the previous chapter, but also because they defeated the army that Sisera was leading, and also to devise this thing where Jael went in and killed the general. So I'll read a little bit, and then if you have questions, or I'll stop or whatever at some point. Then Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, when locks are long in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes, to the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry prospered in Israel, they grew fat on plunder. Because you arose, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. So this, I kind of love that it talks about how we just, in previous books, we read in Joshua how they're establishing themselves in the land, and now they are settling and being prosperous, which is kind of cool. And they're giving Deborah the credit for a lot of it, which is kind of, they grew flat because you arose, Deborah, right? They prospered. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they repeat the triumphs of the Lord, the triumphs of his peasantry in Israel. Then down to the gates march the people of the Lord. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, utter a song. Arise, Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for him against the mighty. From Ephraim they set out into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kin. From Mashir marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun those who bear the marshal's staff. The chiefs of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar faithful to Barak. Into the valley they rushed out at his heels. Among the clans of Reuben there were great searchings of heart. Why did you tarry among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben there were great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he abide with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, settling down by his landings. Zebulun is a people that scorn death. Naphtali too on the heights of the field. So when this is interesting because there's tribes that are mentioned, almost all the tribes are mentioned here. And some are mentioned with good terms, and some are mentioned with not complimentary terms. See, the chosen people are not a united people. The tribes are led very differently, right? 6 tribes are responded with when there was a threat. Ephraim, Benjamin, Mashir, which is Western Manasseh, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali. 4 are censured for not responding: Reuben, Gilead, Dan, and Asher. There's 3 tribes. There are 10 mentioned, but one of them, Manasseh, is split into 2. 3 tribes aren't mentioned: Judah, Simeon, and Levi. But Levi is the tribe of the temple, so that may be part of it. But yeah, it's sort of interesting that it's almost like the battle's over, the general's dead, and now in this, what is essentially a song, a poem, it says, hey, you guys helped and you guys didn't.
Yeah.
It's sort of calling them out, right? After it's like this final score, the final tally. Well, how come if we're united people, how come you guys didn't help and you guys did? Reuben, Gilead, and Dan and Asher are all the ones there. So yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, it's a little petty. I think, there's great, whenever you see it says the Song of, I just kind of assume, and it's actually a good assumption that these were actually sung in the temple in the first, in the time after this was. So this was a song that was sung, and it's basically picks on half of the chosen people, essentially, who didn't help in this battle.
Remind them of their history.
Yeah. So imagine if there was a song written that had your family, mentioned and said, and it was sung all over the place and said, yeah, but Judy Johnson's family didn't help in the battle. I mean, it's kind of mean in a way that in that
Yes, it is.
sense. But they
It wouldn't bring me back to worship again next Sunday.
right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just interesting that they're all like Ephraim, they set out in the valley, Benjamin with your kin. It lists the ones that came out at the first part. Yeah. And I just want to say, because we're going to see this going into the rest of Judges, especially, and in Samuel, other places, the tribes are just not united. You know, when we talk about that much later, Israel is attacked, conquered by Assyria and by Babylon. But I would say there's almost more instances of war and bloodshed between the tribes as there is in the Bible, as there is from outside groups. You kind of already see it. They're behaving as they're like separate countries, separate states that are making their own decisions. Well, we don't want to fight. That's not our war, even though they should all be one.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see what's going to become some war between the tribes later on here, since they're making their own decisions separately. We saw that a little bit in Joshua too. I don't know if you remember when we read Joshua, some of the decisions were made on how the land was going to be divided up was made by the individual groups, the individual tribes of Israel, rather than by the whole. So there's competition among them, which is not, in some cases, I mean, at the time, I've said this before, but at the time of Jesus, there's only 2 tribes of the 12 tribes left. And for the most part, those other tribes have been gone for at least 500 years, at least almost 600 years minimum, and probably closer to 1,000 years. 1,000 years of there being basically just 2 tribes of Israel. I think a lot of it comes from this infighting. So some of it from foreign powers conquering them, but mostly from infighting. And intermarrying and other things too. Back to verse 19. The kings came, they fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The onrushing torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. Then loud beat the horses' hooves with the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, curse bitterly its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the mighty. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, the tent-dwelling woman most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Imagine singing that as part of a song.
Yeah.
I'm just reading this. The Kisham River is mentioned, but possibly something similar to what happened with leaving Egypt. The chariots of the enemy were mired in mud, and the river rushed over them. It's also interesting. So it sounds like he fell, but in the story we read in the previous chapter, he was asleep when she drove the tent peg into his head.
Yeah.
It sounds more like, she defeated him in battle rather than she snuck up on him and did it. But I think it's funny. Imagine that's a verse. I'm trying to picture this whole thing as a song, and it's just kind of funny,
Yeah.
She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple.
Pretty descriptive.
Yeah.
But he was her enemy. He was Israel's enemy.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember. I'm just going to repeat the story because I was gone last week. So Sisera's army is defeated by Deborah, by the combined army of the people. But Sisera gets away.
Okay.
And he's hiding among the people, and he hides in the tent of Jael. And Jael wisely knows who he is and wisely says, "No, you can stay here. I'll keep you safe," meaning not to do that.
Yeah.
And gives him, we think, a sedative, something to make him sleep. It says it gives him milk with herbs or something, I think. So he was meant to be more drowsy, and of course, when he falls asleep, he grabs the tent. So it wasn't that defeated the whole army. The army had already been defeated, but the general got away.
Yeah.
So, okay, almost done with Deborah's song. There is a Susanna song too. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera gazed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest ladies make answer. Indeed, she answers the question herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? A girl or two for every man. Spoil of dyed stuffs for Sisera. Spoil of dyed stuffs embroidered. 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for my neck as spoil. So perish all your enemies, O Lord, but may your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. And the land had rest 40 years. We had a previous chapter where we tend to like assume everything is exactly in time order, and it sometimes it is. There are other places that it's not. Through these books, which are called the history books, it sort of follows, but we had another time where it said, and 70 years passed, and that's all it said.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay. I think it was the end of Joshua. They had settled in the tribes area, and it said, and then 70 years passed, and Joshua died. Okay.
Well, nothing important happened in there.
I guess. Yeah. So here we have, after this event with Deborah and with Jael, and then 40 years pass.
Yeah.
Okay. A generation in that case. So we're going to get into the story of Gideon, which is I think one of the funniest stories in the whole Bible. I mean, funny, but also a sign of how much God can do with how little, I guess, is another way to put it. But it's a chapter and a half away, but I'm sure you remember the story where they had, he had, I don't know, 40,000 troops, and he was going against another army, and God said, "You have too many troops. I want to prove that my power is with you." And God kept paring down the troops until only the ones that kneeled and lapped water out of the river rather than cupping it with their hands could fight for him, which was like 300. And then it's actually kind of creative the way they won the army against. But they had more than enough soldiers, and they said they sent them all away so we could prove God's power.
Mhm.
It's a humorous kind of a story, but we'll get to that. Hopefully we'll get to it today. So 40 years pass, and would someone else like to read beginning of chapter 6? I have no problem reading, but the very first line, we see this so often in scripture. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. People all would continue to mess up all the time.
Has that changed?
No.
No.
I I think the difference is, and we talked about this, I don't know if we talked about it on Sunday in the Sunday Bible study or here, but the difference is the way that people see the way God works is if the people do, it's what we call prosperity gospel, which is if the people do bad, then God will, then they're being punished. Or if something bad is happening, they must have done something wrong. If things are good, then they must be doing something right. The problem with that is sometimes bad things happen that are outside of anybody's control.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't think it's a real healthy theology, but it was pretty predominant with the Jews of that time. So if we were conquered by an army, it must be that we've been morally poor. But I'm sure they're morally poor when they were in times of prosperity too. They weren't being conquered, so it was okay then, or something. The hand of Midian prevailed over Israel, and because of Midian, the Israelites provided for themselves hiding places in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. For whenever the Israelites put in seed, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the land as far as the neighborhood of Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. For they and their livestock would come up, and they would even bring their tents as thick as locusts. Neither they or their camels could be counted, so they wasted the land as they came in. Thus Israel was greatly impoverished because of Midian, and Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites, and he said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and I gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not pay reverence to the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not given heed to my voice." My question is, when I read this, is who's the prophet?
Mhm.
It doesn't actually say which prophet, who was the prophet that was speaking to them. Yeah, usually the prophets are named, so it's just kind of interesting that it wasn't there. We had the same kind of thing happen, when different armies conquer the people, that it was because of their failure, the worshiping of idols, or their moral failure or whatever. That happens continually, right? Now the angel of the Lord came out and sat under the oak at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior." Gideon answered him, "But sir, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our ancestors recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has cast us off and given us into the hand of Midian." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and said to him, and go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you." He responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least of my family." The Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Then he said to him, If now I have found favor with you, then show me a sign that is you who speak with me. Do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you." He said, "I will stay until you return." The other thing that hit me here is, how many times in the Bible does God choose the weakest and smallest and youngest to be the leader? It happens quite often.
Yep.
Right?
All the time.
Yeah.
And it's still happening today.
Remember, "Here I am, send me," where there's so many times where the weakest and the smallest is chosen, and usually they reply, "Wait a second, I'm not the one to choose."
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and even in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew, the four women that are listed in that genealogy are not people of royalty or wealth or anything like that.
Right.
They were definitely common, ordinary women, as we would think of them.
Yeah. It happens time and time again. It's these, I mean, even think of Joseph, the youngest brother, right? Or David,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of these were, you almost have the same. I'm trying to remember if it's Samuel. Who is it? The one where it's Eli and the child is being called by God, and he says, "Did you call me?" Yeah, I remember
Oh, Samuel.
that.
Samuel.
I think that is Samuel. Yeah.
Yes.
All these different times that a young child is being called, and they say, "Surely it's not me."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even David says, "Oh, you don't mean me." And David is considered later on to be one of the great kings of Israel. But when he's a child, no, you're not calling me to be the leader, right? We think about David and Goliath, but David as a boy commands armies too, early on. So yeah, it's interesting that it's sort of that story gets repeated a lot. So here is Gideon. So Gideon went into his house and prepared a kid and 11 cakes from an ephah of flour. A kid is a coat. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the 11 cakes and put them on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the 11 cakes, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the 11 cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. And Gideon perceived that it was the angel of the Lord, for Gideon said, "Help me, Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die." Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Israelites. That night the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull, the second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred pole that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold there, in proper order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the sacred pole that you cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. Because he was too afraid of his family and the townspeople to do it by day, he did it by night. When the townspeople rose early in the morning, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the sacred pole beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. So they said to one another, "Who has done this?" After searching and inquiring, they were told, "Gideon, son of Joash, did it." Then the townspeople said to Joash, "Bring out your son so that he may die, for he has pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole beside it." But Joash said to all who were arrayed against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been pulled down." Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, "Let Baal contend against him," because he pulled down his altar. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and crossing the Jordan, they encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Israelites were called out to follow him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. So it says that he's a young boy, but then it also says that he called his servants.
Well, if he was in a family that had servants,
Yeah.
the head of the family would.
Well,
on the
it only
servants.
says his son Gideon. I guess his son could be of any age.
Yeah,
I visualized a child,
yeah.
And now he's about to lead an army.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Gideon said to God, in order to see whether you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said, I'm going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me. Let me speak one more time. Let me please make trial with the fleece just once more. Let it be dry only on the fleece, and on the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry in the fleece only, and on the ground there was dew. All this testing of God.
Yeah.
What was it was in our lessons. Well, we have the what was the testing? I'm trying to remember how it went. You know, oh yeah, if will you destroy the town for the sake of 20?
Mhm.
Oh no, not to destroy the town for the sake of 20. Oh, please, Lord, don't be upset with me asking again. Will you destroy it for the sake of 10? No, I won't destroy it for the sake of 10. Well, sorry, Lord, I hate to ask again, but will you destroy it for the sake of 5? Oh no, I won't destroy it for the sake of 5. Right? So it's a similar kind of pushing God a little bit, pushing, like, well, you said you'd do this, but I'm just making sure you're really a God of your word, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So this test with putting a fleece on a section of fleece on the ground, and make the dew only on the fleece but not on the ground, and then dew only on the ground but not on the fleece to
Yeah.
test God. Okay.
Pretty tricky.
Now we come to the funny story that I think is quite funny. Then Zerubbabel, that is Gideon, and all the troops that were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, below the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, my own hand has delivered me. Now therefore proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home. Thus Gideon sifted them out. 22,000 returned and 10,000 remained. He had 32,000 troops.
That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. And there are, I'm trying to remember, I'm looking ahead, how many there are. There were, I don't know, however many, 20 or 30,000 of the Midianites. He just sent away 2/3 of his troops because, if you win with all those troops, then clearly it was by your hand, not by God's hand.
Mhm.
Okay. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the troops are still too many. Take them down to the water and I'll sift them out for you there. When I say this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. When I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, all those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. All those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouth, you shall put to the other side. The number of those that lapped was 300, but all the rest of the troops knelt down to drink water. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 that lapped, I will deliver you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go to their homes. So he took the jars of the troops from their hands and their trumpets. They sent all the rest of Israel back to their own tents, but retained the 300. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley. At a certain point, it seems like a silly
Mhm.
thing. But I think this is actually kind of a smart plan. I'll tell you why. Well, we'll read it, and I'll give you a little historical perspective on why there's some value to this plan. That same night, the Lord said to him, get up, attack the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you fear to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and you shall hear what they say. And afterwards your hand shall be strengthened to attack the camp. Then he went down with his servant Purah to the outposts of the armed men that were in the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley as thick as locusts, and their camels were without number, countless as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, I had a dream. And in it a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned upside down, and the tent collapsed. And his comrade answered, there there is no other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the man of Israel. Into his hand God has given Midian and all his army. So the poor army is already convinced that they're going to lose. When Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped, and he returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Get up, for the Lord has given the army of Midian into your hand." After he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets in the hands of all of them and empty jars with torches inside the jars, he said to them, "Look at me and do the same. And when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets around the whole camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." So Gideon and the 100 who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. So the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding in their left hand the torches, and in their right hand the trumpets to blow. And they cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place all around the camp, and all the men in the camp ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against its fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters against them, as far as Beth Barah, and also the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters as far as Beth Barah, and also the Jordan. They captured the 2 captains of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. As they pursued the Midianites, they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon beyond the Jordan. So, there's a couple things. The first thing is the way armies would attack is that at the head of a group of soldiers, there'd be one person with a trumpet. It's happened in other earlier stories in the Bible. But usually there was 1,000 troops with each person with a trumpet. And a torchbearer and a trumpet. So remember, he had 32,000 troops. If suddenly there were 300 trumpets and 300 torches around the camp, it would be wise for the people of Midian to assume that there were 300,000 soldiers, because they're spread out in such a way. And then the Midianites would assume that they're outnumbered. But really, there's just one person with each torch and a trumpet. So it's kind of a crafty little thing, right?
Yeah.
It was a normal kind of way to do battle, that there was one trumpeter for roughly 1,000 troops.
It's a fooled you.
Yeah, totally fooled you, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a neat trick. The other thing is, you notice they did it when essentially the watch. So there were 3 watches. The middle watch, the night watch, and the morning watch. So it's when the watch was changed. So they're already sort of in a state of confusion, right? When that happened. The beginning of the middle watch would have been like essentially afternoon sometime. No, it wouldn't have been afternoon. I'm not really sure when it would be. Anyway, when they're already essentially, clocking in and clocking out in the middle of that, where there were some that were watching, but they were maybe not paying as good attention as they normally would. And there's a large army here, and then this trumpeting all around the hill around, and the torches all being able to be seen at the same time. It would have been pretty dramatic. To have all of that happen at the same time. So I think it's a funny story.
Yeah.
Especially the lapping like dogs, and so I can't have you think that you did it yourself. So
Right.
we're gonna, just prove that God is with you. We're gonna have 300. go against them, and the armies and the camels were too many to count. So we don't know. It doesn't say how many, but there was a lot. Okay, chapter 8. I think we can get through chapter 8. Basically, that'll finish the storyline for Gideon. In a few chapters, we're going to get into the stories of Samson, which are kind of interesting. And some of these stories, I think we hear part of this story in the 3-year lectionary, but there's some things we don't hear it much in the 3 lectionary. We don't hear from Samson at all. We all know the story of Samson, but some of these stories, that's the benefit of doing these Bible studies, is sometimes there are stories that we kind of know or we should know that we don't actually hear in church. Most of the Bible, legitimately, most of the Bible is read in church at some point, but there's some stories that just don't make it when we're on our 3-year lectionary. So, Laura, you're a new visitor to Carlsbad last week?
Actually, I have lived in Carlsbad off and on since 1990, and for years I've been part of just the non-denominational Assemblies of God charismatic churches, and I've just come to a different place in my life where I'm ready to try something different.
Oh, great. They actually treat Bible study a little different too, so.
Yes, sometimes the Bible studies they're not really reading the Bible. It's just based around some author's book or somebody who created a Bible study, and it's not like going through the Bible.
Yeah, I guess I kind of having someone, I mean, Betty Lou and Judy have been in 100 of these probably, but
Yeah.
I think there's a balance between I want to read, but also kind of talk about what's going on. I don't want it to just be dry reading, but it's also good to hear all the context stuff too. So, well, let's finish chapter 8, and that'll probably take us to the end today. Then the Ephraimite said to him, "What have you done to us, not to call us when we went to fight against the Midianites?" And they upbraided him violently. So I just wanted to say that it's a little interesting that some of the tribes helped in the past and some tribes didn't. The tribe of Ephraim is upset that they didn't get called in to help. So he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given into your hand the captains of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" When he said this, their anger against him subsided. So what my Bible mentions is that he didn't call in people from that tribe because they blocked the enemy, because the tribe existed and they were still at home. They blocked the enemy to escape eastward across the Jordan. And the 2 generals crossed over the Jordan and were given into their hands. So it looks like a shrewd thing that he didn't call that tribe, but who knows why they didn't come. Remember, some of them in the earlier chapter didn't come simply because they didn't feel like it, right? But in this case, they were upset they didn't get called in to help. But yet he says, "But no, you had a purpose. You were there to keep them from retreating." Essentially.
But
Then
they didn't know it.
they didn't know they were part of the plan.
Yeah.
Then Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, and he and the 300 who were with him exhausted and famished. So he said to the people of Succoth, "Please give some loaves of bread to my followers, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have in your possession the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna, that we should give bread to your army?" Gideon replied, "Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will trample your flesh on the thorns of the wilderness and the briars." Wow. If you're not going to feed us, I'm going to come back and kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. Real friendly.
Right. From there, he went up to Penuel and made the same request of them, and the people of Penuel answered him as the people of Succoth had answered. So he said to the people of Penuel, when I come back victorious, I will break down this tower. We just want some food. How come you won't feed us? Then now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men bearing arms had fallen. So that's the number that was in that battle. He took 300 against 120,000.
Wow.
But now 15,000 are left. So Gideon went up by the caravan road east of Nobah and Jogbeha and attacked the army, for the army was off its guard. Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and threw all the army into a panic. So he only has 300, and he still beat 15,000. And when Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, he caught a young man, one of the people of Succoth, and questioned him. And he listed for him the officials and elders of Succoth, so 77 people. Then he came to the people of Succoth and said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, do you already have in your possession the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna that we should give bread to your troops who are exhausted? So he took the elders of the city and took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he trampled the people of Succoth. He also broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So part of my question here, remember there are mostly the tribes of Israel are all throughout the land, but some of these are cities, right? Some of these cities are non-Jewish cities. Not all the non-Jews were cast out. So I tried to look up. Succoth is not. It's not obvious that Succoth is that, but the other city, wherever it was, Penuel, is a primarily non-Jewish city. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a cultural reason for, and Succoth might have been, for it to say like, well, these, we're supposed to live in the land peacefully with these people that are here, but if they're not going to feed us, then there's no reason for them to. They're not going to support us, then there's no reason to let them continue to live. Yeah. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what about the men who you killed at Tabor? They answered, as you are, so were they, every one of them. They resembled the sons of a king. And he replied, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, go kill them. But the boy did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a boy. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, you come and kill us, for as the man is, so is his strength. So Gideon proceeded to kill Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescents that were on their necks, on the necks of their camels. I'm not sure what that last thing is. Death at the hand of a mere boy would mean great disgrace and perhaps greater suffering. Is interesting. So Zebah and Zalmunna, the Oreb and Zeb were the generals, but Zebah and Zalmunna are the kings of the two Midianite armies. So he's gotten the generals, and now he's killed the kings.
Okay.
And go ahead.
The ornaments of the camels' necks, would that have been because that those were the camels that the two kings rode? And
Probably,
they were
yeah.
dedicated to the kings or something like that?
It may have also been sort of spoils of war, kind of, probably because they were the kings. They were ornamental and maybe, had precious stones or whatever. I'm not totally sure, but I'm assuming it was the ones that they rode. Yeah.
No.
And Midian, by the way, I'm trying to find here. I think Midian is an outside land, but I'm trying to remember exactly where. I think it's the south, actually.
Yeah.
I think Midian is to the south of the Holy Land, but I'm not entirely sure.
In Midian, wasn't that also part of what is now the peninsula where Saudi Arabia and Yemen are, because
Yeah, yeah.
clear back in Moses' time, Moses' wife Zipporah was from Midian.
Yeah, I think
Isn't it all in that peninsula?
it's yes. Most of the conquering of the people happened from the north, but I'm pretty sure Midian is to the south, and it's that area you're talking about, right? That the Sinai Peninsula area south between Egypt and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I think, but I'm having trouble finding it here. Yeah, when they are conquered by, especially by the Babylon and Assyria, those I said not many armies conquered from the east, because there's a desert there and they wouldn't survive the journey. And there are civilizations to the southeast and to the south toward Egypt, but the Assyria and Babylon both conquered from the north, so they came along above to the north around the, and so part of the reason, I think one of the reasons we can say that the 12 tribes dissolved, and it was mostly the northern tribes that went down first, is those tribes are being over 1,000 years, they get conquered at least 3 times, and from the north. So they're conquered, there's some intermarrying, there's some intermixing of culture, and over time there just isn't a societal structure anymore. Certainly by the time of Jesus. Let's finish this. It's almost time here. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Then Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Each of you give me an earring he has taken as booty." For the enemy had golden earrings because they're Ishmaelites. "We will willingly give them," they answered. So they spread a garment, and each threw into it an earring he had taken as booty. The weight of the golden earrings they requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. That's a lot. Apart from the crescents and the pendants of the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian and the collars that were on the necks of their camels. Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his town in Ophrah, and all Israel prostituted themselves to it there. It became a snare to Gideon and his family. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they lifted up their heads no more. So the land had rest 40 years in the lands of Gideon. It's interesting, a snare to Gideon. He actually made kind of an idol, in a sense.
Yeah.
An idol to himself, basically, which is interesting. After he said, "I'm not going to rule you, God's going to rule you, but I'll build a little golden statue of me so you can admire it," right? The other thing is, and this is verse 24, "For the enemy had golden earrings because they're Ishmaelites." Do you know what an Ishmaelite is?
They're from the tribe of Ishmael.
Which was descended from where?
Abraham's son Ishmael.
Yeah, and what do they become later on, about 1,000 years later?
Muslim.
Yep.
Correct.
So it was essentially, the Midianites were the early form of Islam. So we have the story of Abraham, which is now 1,000 years past, and I've had this conversation before, where a lot of the Quran has all of the Torah in it, and has some other parts of the Old Testament in it, because they follow the God of Israel. And so the story of Ishmael and Hagar leaving Ishmael in the desert under a bush, that's where they take their pilgrimage, and they walk around the valley 7 times. That's in the Bible. That story's in the Bible. So the stories are more interwoven than we even sometimes realize. Ishmaelites, which will come up again later on, are what will become Muslims, the followers of Ishmael. Yeah. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went on to live in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons. Whoa.
Yeah.
70 sons, his own,
Not just one wife, I'm sure.
for he had many wives.
Oh, yes, he had many wives.
His concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age. And I love that, a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash at Ophrah of the Israelites. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites relapsed and prostituted themselves with the Baals, making Baal Berith their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of all their enemies on every side, and they did not exhibit loyalty to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and return for all the good that he had done to Israel. Yeah, and then we have, it's funny how we think of, you say, but traditional biblical marriage. You hear ever people say traditional biblical marriage? Well,
Oh,
here's
yeah.
Gideon with his many wives and his
Yeah.
concubine, and nobody's questioning that as a moral problem.
No.
Right.
Mhm.
People say traditional biblical marriage. I'm like, really? Do you read the Bible?
I guess they're
Not the old-
referring to the New Testament.
Right. Well, even the New Testament, there's some interesting combinations of a few places, but awesome. We will stop there this week. We basically get the story of Gideon. We have a little bit of a few other stories for a couple of chapters, and then we start to get into several chapters with Samson. So very good. Let's close with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for your word, the history of your people. Let us use it to remind ourselves that even though we often fail and we often let you and ourselves down, we know that you still love us. You still are with us. You still guide us and support us. And as you did the people. Thank you for your servants of this and every time, for your servants Gideon and Deborah and others who listened to your call and followed you and led others to you. All this in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
And thank you. And thank
Thank
you,
you.
Laura, for being with us. I look
Yes.
forward to seeing you face to face the next time our churches get together.
Yes.
And welcome to our Bible study. And I hope to see you again next week.
I'm trying to make it. I have a job where on Thursdays I don't have to go in till